My name is John Benet Ramsey, and I'm 5.5.
People that tell me he didn't act right, I take great offense to. I think I could write the book on how you should act.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. This is going to be a shorter than usual episode. This is the Khan's Order number 8, dealing with the Boulder police. And I think anything Judge Khan said about the Boulder police has got to be seen in context to what she said describing her verdict in a 2014 Senate questionnaire. We'll deal with that in more detail closer to the end of the series. There's still about 10-12 episodes to go. But during her appointment to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, she actually tried to distance herself from the verdict that she came to in 2013, 11 years earlier. Maybe you wouldn't say distance herself, but she certainly was trying to explain, perhaps making excuses for the decision that she reached. She said something to the along the lines of, the decision that she reached did not include the police investigative reports. So you don't have the police investigative reports, so now you're going to prognosticate on what you thought the Boulder police were doing and doing wrong. Do you think that's fair? Also, did you notice in the clip played at the beginning of this episode, John says on CNN, I think I could write the book on how you should act. Just kind of an ironic statement, I think, that he made to Larry King on CNN. I've just narrated chapter 13 in The Craven Silence, the first book in the trilogy, and it's a chapter on Patsy Ramsey, specifically related to her doing her makeup on the morning of or the day after Christmas. And that chapter is actually written by my co-author. It's a chapter I couldn't have written simply because I don't do makeup myself, and I just think it is a very insightful chapter because in some areas of certain crimes you do need a woman's touch. You need a woman to look at another woman and say, wow, I would never do that, or that doesn't make any sense. And so in that sense, I think it's a very very carefully crafted chapter based on a woman's intuition and also based on the statements that Patsy made in the 1998 interrogation, specifically to Tom Haney. So good job done there by Lisa Wilson. Something else I want to let you guys know about, I'm doing a live stream at 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time today. It'll mostly be focusing on the Watts case, but there will also be some elements of true crime news. And if there are any questions on the John Benet Ramsey case, you guys are welcome to ask. Thank you to the almost 100 people who have subscribed since the last video. If you haven't subscribed, please do. You can click on the blue icon on the bottom right of your screen. Do you see it over there? You can click on there. Have you clicked? Like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So in this episode we are going to look at page 25, dealing with the investigation of the murder, and also page 26, and that is it, just the 2 pages. I think what is interesting to compare is the amount of pages given over to the police investigation, how much is going to deal with that, and how much is going to deal with Andrew Louis Smith, Detective Lou Smith. How much credence, how much focus the judge gives to a investigator essentially hired by the Ramseys. He was definitely in Team Ramsey in the sense that he totally supported their case, and they often sang his praises, and so now you have the judge doing the same. And as a result, the Khan's Order, you can kind of anticipate that it's going to be all about what Lou Smith is saying. I just think it's quite crazy that she didn't really consult the police records, but then it is a civil case. But having said that, then she consults whatever Lou Smith said. It seems a bit unfair, doesn't it? So the Khan's order on page 25, almost at the top of page 25, starts off, quote, "At the time of John Benet's murder, the Boulder Police Department had limited experience in conducting a murder investigation. Commander John Eller was primarily responsible for the investigation, which was his first murder investigation." End quote. Now, once again, if you bear in mind what she's saying here, in the context that she herself didn't read the police reports, it's more than a little misleading, isn't it? And, you know, when you read Steve Thomas's book, I think it's got over 600 reviews. It's the most reviewed book on the John Benet Ramsey saga. You would hardly think that this book is as credible and as authoritative and definitive as it is, given this already undermining assessment by the judge. And one wonders whether she's read his book. Probably not. She is accurate to say that the Boulder police were to some extent naive, inexperienced, all those words, because Boulder just wasn't the sort of place that had murders. And I think if you want to be technically accurate, I don't think John Benet was murdered. She was killed, and her death was actually an accidental death. And I think if you had to do a poll, you'd probably find even the people who believe that the Ramseys were involved would probably also say that John Benet was deliberately killed. I don't think that is the case. I think it's a minority view, but I think that is actually the accurate view. But even in an accidental death scenario, you still have serious things going on. The covering up of something like that, well, why is that happening? And that's a very important question. Why would you cover something up? I think it was accidental, but I also don't think it was. I think it was almost inevitable. So an accident that happens that's inevitable, is it really so accidental? So there's an area of it that I think starts to implicate people in terms of, shouldn't you have done something? Knowing that that and that and that happened, shouldn't you have done something? Shouldn't you have acted because you've got custody over this little child? Shouldn't you have done this? Shouldn't you have done that? And then, you know, instead of that, covering something up, possibly covering something up, that then becomes quite serious. It's interesting how Judge Carnes also kind of, I don't want to say maligns, but basically undermines Steve Thomas. She says, this is quoting from the report, quote, "One lead detective assigned to the case, Stephen Thomas, had no prior experience with a murder investigation and had previously served as an undercover narcotics officer." Right? And that's the end of the quote. That's all that she really says, is he has no experience, right? And when you read Steve Thomas's book, you actually get a sense of what a fine fellow he is, someone who really was a good investigator. It's just a pity that Steve Thomas, and possibly this was due to a lack of experience, went the route that he went on. I'm not saying there wasn't evidence implicating Patsy, but I think part of what the route Steve Thomas took was perhaps kicking against the route that Lou Smith took. So it was almost like yin and yang. The yin was repelled, or it's almost like two forces that are in opposition to one another. And to the extent that Lou Smith was going the one way, Steve Thomas was definitely kicking the other way. And even if Steve Thomas didn't, was wrong about Patsy's involvement, he certainly contributed a vital aspect to the canon around the Ramsey case. A lot of insight, especially into Boulder PD as well. I think he was one of the best soldiers, the best, I can't think of a better word, the best soldiers in the fight for justice for John Benet Ramsey. Carnes also refers to Mark Beckner, saying, quote, "Finally, the officer who took charge of the investigation in October 1997, Mark Beckner, also had limited homicide experience, end quote. And so you're going to have all of this. Well, this person's not experienced, they didn't know anything, and then let's bring in Lou Smith, the champion, the guy who's going to sort all of this out, and let's rely on his experience. So she goes on to say, quote, many mistakes were made during the course of the investigation. For example, a series of events compromised the crime scene. Moreover, the police did not request to interview the defendant separately on the day that JonBenét's body was found. That's also not entirely accurate. You did have John and Patsy in different rooms in the home. It's difficult to say whether Linda Arendt asked for this or whether it was actually in defiance of Linda Arendt saying, can you guys all just stick to this room? But you did actually have the Ramseys separate, and you actually did have Linda Arendt, not necessarily by design, but questioning the Ramseys each in turn, Patsy and John separately. And I'm going to be following this series, the Khan series, with Linda Arendt's report. I can't remember if it's 19 pages, but it's quite a few pages, and we're going to be dealing with that after this series. At around about 1:30, about half an hour after JonBenét's body was found, Bill Mason overheard John Ramsey. He was speaking on the phone, and he was trying to arrange for a private plane to leave the state. That's not mentioned in the Khan's report. Bill Mason kind of intervened and told John Ramsey, he wanted him in Boulder. They needed them to cooperate. They needed them to answer questions. Specifically, the police needed to talk to the Ramseys in a formal sense, right? And besides all of this, Bill Mason, his idea, and I mean, Bill Mason was later taken off the case. His idea was that the Ramseys go to a hotel that evening, and the whole idea was that at this hotel they could be put in separate rooms and interviewed separately. And at the hotel there could be a little bit of a not a barrier, but a access control to who could see the Ramseys and where the Ramseys could go. And I think when I say to their credit, I mean in the sense of the Ramseys protecting themselves. John Ramsey simply refused. He's saying, he said, give us a day. And I think that's a credit to John Ramsey's guile, if that's the word. Maybe you could say his intelligence, his wit, his charm, and perhaps his prestige as an entrepreneur, as a influential businessman. He could say to the police, listen, give us a day. And the police unfortunately relented. And that is a sign, I think, of lack of experience. You don't defer to someone who is a crucial person of interest or witness or suspect to a case to say, oh, okay, we're going to give you a grace period in which to answer this. And obviously after that point there was really no turning back. There's no the pendulum had already swung against the Boulder police, and it would never really come back from that point. The other thing is, although the Ramseys were eventually interviewed separately, it took something like 4 months for that to happen. And that isn't something that Khan seems to acknowledge, that time period is unusual and seems to show lack of cooperation, not cooperation. Then what is quite interesting is she says, quote, they did, however, question defendants jointly at various times on December 26th, 27th, and 28th, and then began to focus the investigation on the defendants as the main subjects. I must say, I find this all very where was the prosecutor when this happened, to interject and say, well, what about all the other people that were the focus of the investigation? including Chris Wolfe. The Boulder police interrogated Chris Wolfe. It's something Jane Harmer emphasized, that no one was investigated more than Chris Wolfe. Now, it's easy to read between the lines and say, or read over the lines. So if you're the Ramseys, you could say, you know what, we were questioned almost the whole morning of December 26th, also in the evening. It's almost like Chris Watts saying, wow, I was questioned the whole afternoon on the Monday, Monday, August 13th. I was questioned the whole afternoon and evening when he got the phone call, and early the next morning when he got another phone call, and throughout the day on Tuesday. But that's not really proper police questioning. Police questioning is when you're in a cubicle, when it's recorded, when the police have got all the information that they need and want, and it's a proper scenario. But you can fudge that and sort of tell the media, oh no, we spoke at length for hours and hours and hours, and then it starts seeming as though the police are, have exceeded their mandate or something. On December the 27th, so not the day after Christmas, but 2 days after Christmas, I think at this point they were perhaps moving from the Fernies to the Bynums, where they stayed for a week. The police didn't speak to John Ramsey until 9:30 at night, which is quite late, wouldn't you say? On the day that they were supposed to, so John Ramsey said, give us a day. Well, the next day they didn't speak to John until 9:30 p.m. And Patsy didn't speak to them whatsoever. Patsy was so heavily medicated and apparently even more distraught that she wasn't speaking to them at all. I do think that I've heard some people say that Patsy took the leading role in terms of talking about the case. I don't really agree with that. I think she could have taken the leading role, but it was John who actually guided and managed the process. That's what it feels like to me. When you watch John on CNN, also the very last interview, which they did, I think, in Hawaii, John seems to take the leadership role in what is said. The same thing happened in the McCann case. You tend to hear most from Jerry McCann, even though in both cases the women in these cases are the people that we most want to hear from, if that makes sense. What is interesting, on the 27th of December, John spoke to the police. I'm not sure if it was Detective Arendt, but he basically focused on the basement window, and then besides that basically said, well, look, I'm leaving the state. I'm heading to Atlanta, and we're not sure when we'll be back. How's that for cooperation? So you eventually had the Boulder police flying to Atlanta, Georgia, where the Ramseys were having the funeral. Just think how unusual that is. Someone dies in a certain state, right? And there's a murder investigation, and then the suspects or the people at the center of it have the funeral in another state. Already that is just strange, isn't it? The other thing that I think is interesting is, did John himself consider himself a Southerner? Bear in mind that they were based prior to living in, besides where he grew up, where he was living before they moved to Boulder was Atlanta. What I do think is quite interesting, I guess, is a mild way of putting it, and this is leading into page 26 of the Khan's order, is that the FBI's suggestion that the Boulder police publicly name the defendants as subjects and apply intense media pressure to them. And I think that is what happened, and I think the Boulder police did leak quite a lot to the media. I've also got to ask, can you blame them in this scenario? Can you blame them? Can you blame the police who have so much pressure on them, and so much intrigue is going on, so much shenanigans, so much strategy that is beyond their control? Are they expected just to sit on their hands? And I think it's to their credit that they engage the media. You might say it's not ethical, but isn't it? You're trying to find justice for John Bonet, and ultimately despite these efforts, the case was derailed. The case, if anything, you could almost say, shouldn't they have done more? Shouldn't they have engaged the media more than they did? And, something like Steve Thomas retiring or resigning and then writing this big letter just saying what is actually going on, that caused tremendous damage to not the investigation, but I think the cover-up. I think it caused tremendous damage to the craziness that was going on at the district attorney's office. And that was, I think, necessary, but think about the damage it did to Steve Thomas. As he sort of left, he wrote this powerful letter, leaving this powerful message, but now he's out of a job. He's off the case. He can't really contribute anymore. And, he ultimately didn't testify before the grand jury. Even so, we know what the grand jury found, don't we? You've also got to wonder where the judge is saying, that the FBI are suggesting that the Boulder police name the defendants as suspects. Is the judge now also thinking, the FBI are also wrong? So the police have got tunnel vision and the FBI also do. That's interesting. And so it's almost like the FBI and the Boulder police on one side of the equation and Lou Smith on the other, in a way. The judge refers to, quote, many statements that implied defendants were guilty and were not cooperating with police, end quote. Now, it's almost as though she's saying, well, first of all, the defendants weren't guilty, and secondly, the fact that they weren't cooperating with the police is a myth. And I think when we're talking about the Ramseys not cooperating with the police, I think you've got to be specific. I think you've got to say, okay, so what is an example of not cooperating, right? And then you could say, well, that's not cooperating, it's just not giving that piece of evidence, or it's just not doing that, and that's justified. So we need to do that. So she goes on to say, quote, in addition to official police releases, many individual officers also released information about the investigation without official authorization, some of which disclosures were highly confidential and potentially undermined the investigation. Really, I'd really like to know what really undermined the investigation. Wasn't it the ransom note? Wasn't it the statement by Alex Hunter about the grand jury? Wasn't it also the Khan's order that undermined everything? I'm not saying that the Judge Khan's deliberately tried to undermine the investigation. I'm just saying there were things that really derailed the investigation. You could argue that the things I've mentioned aren't those things, but I don't know if it was leaks, because there were also leaks from, the Team Ramsey had PR, right? They had a website. They had something I've just seen on a video that I actually posted on Patreon. James Kohler was showing how a psychic came up with this identikit, the sketch of a suspect, and then that sketch really looks a lot like John Mark Carr. And of course the Ramseys put this sketch of the suspect that looked like John Mark Carr, or that seemed to resemble him. It was certainly Kohler's opinion that there was a striking similarity, an eerie similarity. They put this on their website, right? Now, is that not also kind of a leak? So the final paragraph I want to highlight, and I won't take it too much further than that, quote, during the course of the investigation, defendants signed over 100 releases for information requested by the police and provided all evidence and information requested by the police, end quote. Wow, that really they provided all evidence and information requested, including the ransom note that the handwriting analyst couldn't really get access to. Now, that's something I'm quite disappointed that I thought the previous episode, which was quite long, almost an hour long, I was quite disappointed that episode wasn't viewed at least as much as the one before. It's not a rehash, it's not just the same thing, but I guess it does get quite complicated. And I guess you could say, why do we need to know about the intrigue around the handwriting analysts when we know whose handwriting it is. You might make that argument. I do think it is interesting. I think it's interesting the legal game that was played in that area. If you are going to talk about not cooperating, I think one interesting example is like when the Ramseys took the lie detector test. How that came about was it was brought up by Barbara Walters and then again by Larry King when they were publishing and marketing their book in 2000. And so it was sort of like, oh, do the police want us to take a polygraph? Oh, well, if that's what they want, we'll do it. And then they did a couple of months later. And then the results of that test were inconclusive. But it was quite interesting the way that the Ramseys, when they were in public, taking a lie detector, fine, no, it's not a problem. But if you had to ask the police earlier on, would you want the Ramseys to take a lie detector? What do you think they would have said? If you look at the Chris Watts case, Chris Watts took a lie detector test basically on the third day, where the Ramseys it took something like 3 years. And it was with conditions, right? Anyway, it goes on to say that they gave historical handwriting samples and supervised written exemplars. That doesn't really mention how the police had to go to the house in Michigan to actually find handwriting, because there wasn't really, they couldn't find enough samples in the Ramsey home. Then, this is quoting from the very end of page 27. Quote, despite widespread criticism that defendants failed to cooperate in the murder investigation, defendants note that they agreed on at least 3 occasions to be interviewed separately by representatives of the police or Boulder County District Attorney's Office, end quote. Now, as I said, I think you need to be quite specific about cooperation, right? So, first of all, I think it's important to mention that Burke Ramsey's medical records were never provided, right? You might say, well, why would that even be relevant? Well, if you look at what was going on with John Bonet, all her visits to the doctor, that there was, she often had bad breath, she had insomnia, she had colds, she had vaginitis, and so on and so on and so on. And so you might wonder, well, what about Burke's medical records? Did he have urinary tract infections? Did he also have bad breath? How was Burke taken care of? And bear in mind what the grand jury decided ultimately in terms of their charges. Couldn't Burke Ramsey's medical records shed some light on the type of parents that the Ramseys were? And also shed some light on, to some extent, John Bonet's medical status based on Burke's medical status. Bear in mind he was a slightly older child. Something else that was never provided were the Ramseys' complete phone records. If you think about so many other cases, the Chris Watts case, how vital the phone data review is, the Patrick Frazee case, almost every case these days, the phone records are absolutely vital, and you've got to wonder, why were the phone records not provided? Patsy's fur garments were never provided. This is information that I'm getting from an online forum. But it's quite interesting. Patsy's fur garments were never provided, and then also, along with the phone records, full credit card records were never provided either. And this is also quoting from this online forum. It's referring to what Brian Morgan said during the 1998 interviews. He was the Ramsey attorney. This was actually caught on tape. And this is what he said in response to, so bear in mind, Judge Carnes is saying, oh no, the Ramseys gave whatever information was asked, they gave. Okay, except the most important, Patsy's fur coats or fur clothes, whatever, the credit cards, the phone receipts, Burke's medical records. And so when Brian Morgan was asked about it, he said, quote, I have a real problem with certain kinds of medical records. these people, meaning the Ramseys, are entitled to an island of privacy to try to recover from what they have been through. And that's a very serious issue for me. Now, let's end the quote there for the moment. Now, if you think about the being entitled to islands of privacy, but then they write books, and it's books plural, and they are on television endlessly. So it's basically privacy when it suits them. It's privacy about sensitive stuff, but it's being very public about things that suit them, that are sort of defending their position, right? Doesn't that seem a little bit unfair? That you can have your way, but when it's something that is maybe not necessarily positive, then that's private, right? It's not being very transparent, is it? And so Brian Morgan said, quote, "That's a very serious issue for me, and so we are going to discuss that and make a reasoned decision on it. I think you will get virtually everything you have described, with the possible exception of personal medical records that I think John and Patsy are at least entitled to make a reasoned decision on." And it seems like when he was referring to those personal medical records that he didn't want to make available, that was a reference to Burke's medical records. Quite a lot of song and dance about not revealing Burke's medical records. Why? What's the big deal about Burke's medical records? Why can't you say what's going on there? What's the big deal? So I'm not going to take it further than that. As I said earlier, if you're interested, on Patreon, I'm uploading The Craven Silence already at chapter 13. And later today at 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, I'll be doing a live stream, mostly covering the Chris Watts case. But if you have any questions on the John Benet Ramsey case, I'll be happy to look at them. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.